Hi guys, tonight we're beginning a quiet journey into one of the most haunting chapters of World War II, the sniper war in Stalingrad. You'll hear real stories, not just of bullets and targets, but of patience, fear, cold and quiet minds behind the scope. This isn't about glorifying violence, it's about what it truly meant to lie still for hours, breathing through frost, waiting. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. Let's begin with where it all started, the moment Stalingrad turned into a city of shadows. The story of Soviet sharpshooters in Stalingrad doesn't begin with rifles or kill counts. It begins with desperation. By late 1942, the city had already become a graveyard of glass and stone, where every window frame, every burned-out tram, every pile of rubble was no longer just wreckage, but potential shelter, cover, or ambush. The German Sixth Army had stormed toward the Volga with lightning speed, confident in their momentum, but they were not prepared for what lay ahead. A resistance that didn't follow rules, didn't stop to regroup, and didn't show its face. And among that resistance, a new kind of fighter emerged, one who didn't charge, didn't shout, didn't march, one who simply watched. The Red Army had always understood the value of marksmanship, but Stalingrad sharpened that value into something more, a necessity. The Soviet command, struggling with inferior equipment and chaotic urban combat, began to see that a single well-placed shot could be more powerful than a dozen wounded men charging across an open square. In the chaos of urban war, snipers became both ghosts and gods. Invisible, patient, feared. The first generation of Stalingrad sharpshooters weren't professionals. Most weren't even trained. They were hunters, shepherds, postal workers, machinists. People who, in peacetime, would never dream of taking a human life, but who now lay for hours beneath frozen metal, adjusting their breath to the rhythm of enemy footsteps. One of them was Ivan, a forestry student from the Urals, who had never been to a city before Stalingrad. His hands, once used to trees and bark, learned to grip a rifle with terrifying stillness. He was quiet, slow-moving and methodical, all qualities that made him invisible in the ruins. His first kill came not with triumph, but with nausea. He had aimed for minutes, letting snow settle on his coat, until the young German soldier stepped into the crosshairs, just 20 meters away, unaware. After the shot, Ivan couldn't move for another hour. Not out of fear of being seen, but because he was crying. That was the kind of sniper Stalingrad made. They weren't machines, they weren't hunters, they were human beings trying to survive in a war that erased everything else. The rifles they used were often outdated Mosin Nagants, but with scopes fixed by hand and zeroed by feel. They slept in cellars with rats and frostbite, woke to shell fire, and ate whatever they could scrape together. Their job wasn't just to kill, it was to unnerve, to sap the enemy's spirit, to make the Germans afraid of walking the streets in daylight. And it worked. German soldiers began to speak of Russian shadows, of ghosts who never missed and never showed themselves. A simple walk through a ruined alley became a death sentence. The psychological weight of Soviet snipers was perhaps greater than their kill count. They made the enemy feel watched, hunted, vulnerable. And at night, when the fighting paused and the city held its breath, snipers remained awake, lying beneath blankets of ash and snow, listening, waiting, breathing slow. Their world was silence, broken only by the soft click of a scope cover opening. This is where it began, not with famous names, but with unknown faces, holding their rifles in a dead city, trying not to blink. In the next part, we'll follow how these individuals became part of something bigger, a system of sniper training and tactics that would change the course of the battle. The sniper war in Stalingrad didn't just grow out of necessity, it evolved into a deadly art, refined by the conditions of the ruined city, and shaped by the minds of those who chose to lie still, silent and unseen. As German troops advanced deeper into Stalingrad, The Red Army began to recognize that urban warfare offered unique advantages to those willing to wait, to blend in, to strike only once, but with precision. Buildings became hives of hidden shooters. Twisted steel and shattered bricks offered a perfect vantage point, and even burnt-out factories and apartments transformed into training grounds for an entirely new breed of soldier. In the fall of 1942, the Soviet command saw what was happening in isolated cases, one sniper holding back dozens of enemy soldiers, and decided to formalize what had once been instinct. That's when the concept of sniper schools inside Stalingrad began. Not official, grand institutions with flags or banners, but makeshift academies led by experienced marksmen, often just a few streets away from the front. These schools weren't measured in weeks. They were crash courses in survival, in the psychology of killing, and in how to think like your enemy. Trainees learned to judge distances by eye, to stay motionless for hours, to read wind and shadow, and to wait without blinking, as dust settled on their cheeks. The instructors were often young men who had already racked up dozens of kills, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Their lessons were calm, cold, methodical, lessons learned the hard way. One of the most legendary of these impromptu instructors was a man named Anatoly Chekhov, who had begun as a warehouse guard, and had shown such an unnatural calm under fire that he was selected to teach others. He didn't shout, didn't scold, didn't encourage. He simply sat next to his students, showed them how to crawl through rubble without making a sound, how to use broken mirrors to watch alleyways, how to exhale just as they pulled the trigger. His most important lesson: be patient longer than your enemy. He's in a hurry. You're not. The students came from all walks of life: teenagers, veterans, even women who had worked in textile mills, and now held rifles steadier than most men. Among them was a young girl named Galina, who had grown up in Rostov, and had lost her father in the first months of the war. Her hands shook when she first held the rifle. But when Anatoly took her to the rooftop of a collapsed department store, and told her to observe a German outpost from 300 meters away, something in her face changed. She became still, her eyes narrowed. She whispered, "I can see them playing cards." Anatoly nodded, said nothing more. 2 days later, she made her first confirmed kill. And her shot was so quiet that even her spotter didn't realize she had fired until she was already adjusting her position. Galina would later go on to become one of the most feared female snipers in the city. These sniper schools, however crude, began producing results that were impossible to ignore. In areas where Soviet snipers operated, German patrols slowed down, sometimes refusing to enter certain neighborhoods at all. Morale reports from the German side showed rising anxiety, soldiers who refused to walk past specific windows or cross exposed streets. The psychological toll was immense. One well-placed sniper could paralyze an entire platoon for hours. But it wasn't just about the kill, it was about control. Soviet snipers controlled space, time, and fear. They made the city feel alive, aware, watching. And in a war of attrition, where every hour mattered, that control became a weapon, more powerful than bullets. The sniper schools also built camaraderie. These weren't lone wolves. They operated in pairs, a shooter and a spotter, often switching roles to keep their focus sharp. The spotter was just as critical, scanning with binoculars, marking wind, sometimes even providing a quiet word of encouragement. They shared food, stories, silence. In the darkest hours of night, when the city held its breath, these pairs would crawl through broken pipelines and sewer tunnels, positioning themselves before dawn for a single moment of advantage. Some of them never made it back. A sniper's life in Stalingrad was not romantic. It was cold, hungry, terrifying. Every breath had to be measured, every blink timed. They wore rags over their boots to move silently, rubbed ash on their faces to avoid glare, and tied themselves to chimneys so they wouldn't slide off in their sleep. They were not gods. They were ordinary people who had learned how to disappear. In the next part, we'll follow how their growing effectiveness began to shift the entire German strategy, and how one man, Vasily Zaitsev, would soon turn the sniper war into a legend whispered on both sides of the Volga. Vasily Zaitsev did not arrive in Stalingrad as a hero, he arrived as a sailor. Born in the Ural Mountains and trained in marksmanship by hunting wolves in the snowy forests with his grandfather, Zaitsev had a calm, quiet demeanor and eyes that noticed everything. When he volunteered to be transferred to the front in Stalingrad, he didn't ask for a sniper rifle. He just brought the calm of the woods into the chaos of a ruined city. In his first 10 days in the rubble of Stalingrad, using a simple Mosin Nagant with iron sights, he eliminated over 30 enemy soldiers, including officers and machine gunners, simply by observing carefully and firing only when absolutely necessary. His natural patience, his instinct for hiding, and his understanding of how people move when they feel safe, turned him into something more than a soldier. He became a ghost that German troops whispered about. Zaitsev didn't only fight from rooftops. He hid in the folds of debris, inside shattered walls, beneath floors, even among corpses. His kills were clean, precise, and always calculated. But it wasn't just his skill that made him a legend, it was what came next. Recognizing his effectiveness, the Soviet command brought him into the growing sniper training units and tasked him with teaching others the art of invisible war. Vasily didn't create killers, he created hunters of fear. He taught his students not just where to shoot, but when not to. His motto was simple: patience is the best camouflage. Soon, his students were spreading throughout the city, turning the broken skeleton of Stalingrad into a labyrinth, watched by unseen eyes. His work began to influence the entire defensive structure of the Soviet resistance. A single sniper on a rooftop could delay an enemy advance for hours, redirect troops into traps, force the Germans to waste precious artillery fire on ghost targets. Zaitsev understood this. He wasn't just eliminating soldiers, he was bending the battlefield. One of his most famous innovations was the use of sniper nests, cleverly hidden positions that took hours, sometimes days, to build. He and his spotter would crawl into bombed-out sewer tunnels, climb into gaps in brickwork, or disguise themselves under debris, often entering their position before sunset and not leaving until the next day. They carried no more than they needed: rifle, scope, a few rounds, a field ration, and silence. There's one particular story often retold, not just for its tension, but for what it reveals about Zaitsev's mind. It's said that in late November 1942, a German sniper, an elite, likely trained in Berlin, was sent specifically to eliminate Zaitsev. The duel lasted several days. Zaitsev knew the other man was trained, patient, and dangerous. For 3 days they hunted each other through destroyed factories, staring through scopes at shadows, never exposing more than a hint of movement. Eventually, Zaitsev tricked the German into revealing his position by placing a helmet on a stick as bait. When the enemy fired, Zaitsev located the glint of the scope, waited for stillness, and took the shot. The kill was confirmed. Though some of the story has been debated over the years, what remains undeniable is this: even in the most silent moments of the sniper war, minds were battling as much as rifles. Vasily Zaitsev eventually recorded over 200 confirmed kills, but his legacy was never just in numbers. It was in the system he helped build, the morale he lifted, and the fear he spread through precision, not brutality. His name became a signal, a warning. Zaitsev is watching, and that alone could halt an entire platoon's advance. His students, nicknamed the Sons of Zaitsev, carried his techniques into every district of the ruined city. By midwinter, German troops were moving like prey, checking every window, every chimney, every rooftop, before daring to cross an open street. The sniper war was no longer an accident of the battlefield, it was part of the city's nervous system. In the next part, we'll dive into the stories of those who fought alongside Zaitsev, the lesser-known sharpshooters who shaped the soul of Stalingrad from behind a rifle scope. They weren't called soldiers, not really. They were simply known as the Sons of Zaitsev. A name born not from bloodline, but from discipline, patience, and an unspoken bond between those who chose the path of silence in a city that never slept. These were the men and women trained directly by Vasily Zaitsev, or shaped by the sniper system he helped refine, volunteers, conscripts, teachers, farmers, and students, who quickly adapted to the brutal logic of survival within the ruins of Stalingrad. Most were no older than 20. Many had never held a rifle before the war. But under Zaitsev's quiet guidance, they transformed into watchers, unseen, unheard, unforgotten. Their job was not to seek glory, but to control the battlefield without ever being seen. Their rifles were extensions of thought, and their greatest weapon was time. They didn't measure victory in the number of confirmed kills, but in the way the enemy slowed down, became hesitant, wasted hours avoiding alleys, sent entire units to track a single shooter. These snipers operated in pairs, shooter and spotter. The spotter didn't just watch for targets, they watched the watcher, ensuring their partner didn't lose track of time, fall asleep, or let frostbite set in. They whispered distances, warned of movement, and sometimes took over the rifle if the shooter's hands began to shake. The bond between them was sacred, forged through frozen hours and near constant stillness. They used no radios, only glances, taps, and the language of breath. Every team had their own signals, their own habits, and their own hiding places. Some hid in attics with lines of fire that stretched across courtyards. Others buried themselves beneath rubble with tiny slits carved out to see the enemy pass. One pair, a boy named Sergei and a former seamstress named Ludmila, spent 4 days in the same crater without moving, surviving on frozen biscuits and melted snow, just to watch a single German machine gun crew. When the moment came, Sergei fired first. Ludmila, watching through her scope, saw the second man reach for the gun. Her shot followed half a second later. Then they waited. Another 2 hours, unmoving, until nightfall allowed them to slip away. In their quiet bravery, they told a new story. One not of charge or retreat, but of calculation, restraint, and knowing exactly when to disappear. They didn't talk about fear, not because they weren't afraid, but because fear was part of the work. They acknowledged it, folded it into their discipline, and then returned to the scope. Their rifles were named like old friends, many of them modified with better scopes, scavenged from the field, triggers softened with cloth, barrels marked with scratches to count the days or kills, or simply remind them who they were. Some decorated theirs with strings of thread or lucky tokens. Not out of superstition, but because in a world of collapsing buildings and shifting snow, even a small object could remind them they were human. One sniper, Mikhail from Siberia, kept a tooth from his family's hunting dog tied to his sling. "He waited with me," he used to say. Stories like these circulated among the snipers, like quiet prayers. There were rules among them too. No unnecessary shots, no showing off. Never fire unless you know where your next cover is, and always, always, watch your partner's face. The Germans, too, began organizing sniper teams in response, but few matched the ruthlessness and patience of the Soviet sniper pairs. The sons of Zaitsev didn't win battles by storm, they won them by waiting, by making the enemy bleed in silence, by never letting them feel safe, even when no shots were fired. Their influence reached beyond the battlefield. In the ruined schools and factories of Stalingrad, they inspired a generation of Red Army soldiers to fight smarter, not louder. They became role models, even if most never knew their names. In war, it is often the loudest acts that get remembered, but in Stalingrad, the quietest warriors left the deepest scars. In the next part, we'll follow the story of one of the few female sniper teams, whose presence not only unsettled the enemy, but shifted the perception of what a Soviet soldier could be. Not all of the snipers in Stalingrad were men, and not all of the silence they carried was shaped by rage or duty. Some carried grief, some carried vengeance, and some carried the quiet resolve of those who had already lost everything. Among the most notable figures in this hidden war were the women who took up rifles and joined the ranks of the Red Army's Sniper Corps, some of them trained outside the city, others molded directly by its ruins. Though few in number compared to their male counterparts, their impact was undeniable, calm, focused, and often underestimated by the enemy. The story of Yelena and Zoya, a sniper spotter pair assigned to the northern districts of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, stands out, not because of how many confirmed kills they made, but because of the way they shattered every expectation laid upon them. Yelena had once been a university student, studying physics in Moscow, while Zoya was the daughter of a coal miner from Donetsk, trained as a nurse before the war. They met during a field medic course near the Volga, and were soon recruited into the sniper division, when instructors noticed how steady Yelena's aim was during training, and how quickly Zoya could read terrain. They became inseparable, not in speech but in rhythm. Yelena was patient to the point of stillness. Zoya could map enemy movement like a chess player. They chose their own nests, often away from the main zones, preferring industrial ruins and wrecked schools, places they said reminded them of before. The men in their unit didn't know what to make of them at first. Some joked, others watched curiously, but that ended the day. Yelena made 3 kills in a single morning, never firing twice from the same spot. Zoya kept time, tracked shadows, counted the seconds between German patrols. They worked like clockwork, and as word spread, German snipers began avoiding their sector. A note found on the body of a fallen German scout even warned others. Avoid the eastern boiler house. 2 shadows there, female devils. But for Yelena and Zoya, there was no sense of pride in these warnings, only the knowledge that their quiet hours in the cold had made a difference. They didn't speak of kills. They spoke of wind, of patience, of staying alive long enough to get one more clear shot. Nights were the worst. The 2 would sleep in shifts, one resting with her cheek pressed against a rifle butt, the other watching the street through cracked glass or snow-covered boards. They wrote letters they never sent, carved dates into brick with broken nails, and sometimes just sat in silence, listening to the dull roar of distant artillery and the creaking of frozen metal. One of the few surviving records of them comes from a report by a political officer who noted, "Comrade Yelena and Comrade Zoya continue to deny the enemy free movement across the tram yard. Their discipline is exceptional, morale high, they ask only for warmer gloves." That was their legacy. Cold hands, steady breath, and streets that stayed empty because 2 young women were watching. And yet, even they were not invincible. One morning in late January, while repositioning along a railway siding, a mortar shell struck a nearby signal tower. The blast buried them in snow and shattered brick. Zoya was hit in the leg. Yelena carried her 2 kilometers through alleys, never once calling for help. She brought her to a Red Army medical post, then disappeared back into the ruins before anyone could thank her. Zoya survived but never fought again. Yelena's name vanished from reports after that. Some say she died a week later. Others believe she continued to fight under a different unit, never revealing who she was. Either way, the sector they once guarded remained silent for weeks. Sniper fire reduced, patrols ceased. The enemy didn't know if they were gone or still watching. That was their power. The women snipers of Stalingrad were never as numerous as the men, but they left a legacy cut in ice and iron. Calm, precise, forgotten by name, but remembered in silence. In the next part we'll shift our attention to how the German forces tried to counter the sniper threat, both through their own sharpshooters, and by turning the city into a hunting ground filled with bait, traps, and psychological warfare. As the sniper threat in Stalingrad grew deadlier and more sophisticated, the German command could no longer afford to treat it as a minor nuisance. Entire squads were being delayed, officers shot mid-conversation, machine gun nests silenced before they could even fire. Something had to be done, and quickly. So the Wehrmacht began to adapt, drawing from their own sharpshooter units and elite marksmen to fight fire with fire. These were not conscripts. They were professionals, trained in the mountains of Bavaria and the forests of East Prussia, many of them veterans from earlier campaigns. They arrived with scoped Mauser rifles, camouflage cloaks, and field-tested precision. But what they lacked was what the Soviet snipers had mastered: Stalingrad itself. The city was not simply a backdrop to the war. It was a living, dying organism, made of dust, steel, and echo, and those unfamiliar with its rhythm were quickly swallowed by it. The German snipers were skilled, undoubtedly. Their shots were clean, their aim deadly, but in the twisted chaos of collapsed factories and frozen stairwells, many found themselves outmaneuvered by Soviet teams who knew the city like they knew their own skin. Still, the German counter-sniper strategy evolved. They began laying traps, leaving helmets on windowsills as bait, creating false movement in alleys using strings tied to broken doors, or even placing wounded soldiers in open areas to draw fire and locate hidden shooters. Some of these methods worked. Several Soviet snipers were lost to such ruses, pulled into exposing their positions by the unbearable weight of compassion, or the illusion of opportunity. But the Soviets adapted just as fast. They began using counterbait tactics of their own, firing only after long observation, switching positions frequently, and coordinating with other teams to confuse enemy patterns. They used broken mirrors to scan streets without revealing themselves, and hung pieces of cloth to catch changes in wind, watching the way smoke moved, or how birds flew off in fear to detect enemy presence. One tactic that proved particularly effective on both sides was the use of sound decoys. German snipers would replicate the metallic click of a Mosin-Nagant's bolt to suggest a nearby Soviet shooter. In response, Soviet snipers began mimicking the soft scrape of a Mauser's stock on brick. It became a duel not of sight, but of deception, each side whispering false clues into the ruined city, hoping to catch the other flinching. In this shadow war, fear itself became a weapon. German patrols began refusing to cross certain intersections in daylight. Orders were given for soldiers to move only under smoke cover. Even the simplest act, looking out from behind cover, became a gamble. German officers began offering medals and bonuses for confirmed sniper kills, hoping to boost morale. But behind these efforts was a creeping sense of helplessness. The Soviets were not just good marksmen, they were ghosts. One German sniper, identified in war records only as Heinz H., was credited with over 40 kills in the northern sector. He worked alone, preferring factory ruins and high vantage points. But according to a captured report, after just 3 weeks in Stalingrad, he wrote in his field journal, "They are not soldiers. They are wind. You see nothing. You feel them. And when you turn, they are gone." Heinz was killed, not by a bullet, but by a collapsing beam, while retreating from a failed duel. His body was never recovered. These stories circulated on both sides, each side mythologizing the other, creating an atmosphere not just of caution, but of dread. The sniper war was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form, one mind against another, each trying to outweight, outthink, outhide the other. And as the winter deepened, so did the quiet. Entire blocks of the city fell silent for days, no movement, no gunfire, only the howl of wind and the creak of ruined metal. Snipers were there, of course, lying still under the snow, behind doors, within chimneys, waiting. In these moments, it was impossible to know who was hunting and who was hunted. In the next part, we'll explore the inner world of a sniper, the thoughts that filled the hours between shots, the rituals they followed, and the fragile line between focus and madness when you are forced to sit motionless in the cold for 16 hours, with your finger resting gently on the trigger. There's a silence inside a sniper that no gunfire can reach, a silence that grows heavier the longer you lie still, watching a world move in fragments beyond your scope. In the ruined streets of Stalingrad, where each building had become a tomb or a trap, that silence became a kind of shelter, a shield between a sniper and the chaos around him. Hours would pass, and not a single shot would be fired. And yet the sniper remained, breathing slow, heartbeat steady. eyes locked through a frozen lens, waiting for a pattern, a mistake, a flicker of movement that did not belong. What does a person think about while lying motionless for 16 hours beneath broken beams and snow-covered rags? The mind wanders at first, to family, to the last warm meal, to faces remembered in pieces, but eventually those thoughts become dangerous. A single memory can make your fingers twitch, can draw your breath too loud, can crack the stillness that keeps you alive. So the snipers learned to think differently. Some recited poetry silently. Others counted bricks, tracked how many rats passed by, watched the way snowflakes landed, or how smoke curled when wind shifted. Rituals formed. One sniper, Dmitri, would always tap his helmet twice before adjusting his position. Another, named Yuri, carried a page torn from a book and reread the words in his head every morning before setting his scope. These small anchors kept their minds from drifting into panic or exhaustion. The cold was constant. Fingers grew numb, jaws locked tight. Blankets were luxuries. Most used coats too thin for the weather, stuffing scraps of cloth under their uniforms. To avoid frostbite, they'd clench their toes every few minutes, barely enough to move. Some wrapped their rifles in fabric to prevent the metal from freezing to their skin. A sniper couldn't afford a flinch, not when pulling the trigger, not even when snow slid down their back. Hunger came next. Rations were sparse, often frozen. Some carried sugar cubes or bits of dry bread in their pockets, sucking on them slowly to stay focused. They never chewed. Chewing made noise. Others drank melted snow through cloth filters to avoid choking on ash. In the loneliest moments, the city felt like it belonged to no one, just a shell of groaning iron and shattered stone, but the sniper knew it intimately. Every broken wall had been measured in their mind, every pile of rubble mapped, every shadow memorized. They knew where the sun would fall, and how long it would take for a bootprint to disappear. They didn't just see the battlefield, they felt it. And still, even with all their control, there were moments when fear crept in, a faint sound behind them, a sudden silence, a glint in the distance that might be another scope. The question whispered in every sniper's mind, am I watching, or being watched? That tension sat in their chest like ice, it never left. Some never spoke about it. Others confessed quietly, only to their spotters, that they sometimes dreamed of pulling the trigger and nothing happening. No sound, no recoil, just silence, like the city had finally swallowed them whole. The mental strain broke some. Others bent, adapted, hardened, but none escaped untouched. In Stalingrad, being a sniper wasn't just about precision, it was about endurance. The longer you could hold yourself together, the longer you could make the enemy fall apart. And so they stayed, motionless, breath shallow, hands frozen to their rifles, waiting not for glory, but for the quiet victory of a single shot that would change the course of a street, a morning, or a life. In the next part, we'll look deeper into how Soviet sniper teams developed unspoken communication methods to survive, and how two minds could become one on the battlefield, when every word was a risk. In a war where noise meant exposure and speech could mean death, the bond between a sniper and their spotter was shaped in silence. It wasn't just teamwork, it was something deeper, something closer to symbiosis. The best Soviet sniper duos in Stalingrad could go entire days without exchanging a single word, yet they moved in perfect sync, understood each other's thoughts through the smallest cues. A tilt of the head, the slow curl of a finger, a sharp breath drawn through the nose. These weren't just habits formed through training, they were born in rubble, and refined through survival. The sniper may have fired the shot, but the spotter was the anchor. They served as the second set of eyes, the weather gauge, the memory. Spotters tracked wind speed by watching smoke rise from shell holes, measured distances by recalling the length of a fallen beam or the width of a shattered window. They memorized patrol patterns, counted the seconds between footsteps, noted the color of dust on a uniform to estimate where the enemy had come from. And when the sniper began to doubt, when fatigue blurred the scope or nerves tightened the trigger finger, it was the spotter who gave a look. Not reassurance, not command, but presence. I'm here. Focus. That was enough. Many teams developed their own language. A system of small hand movements, taps on the shoulder, patterns drawn with a fingernail into a coat sleeve. 1 tap for danger. 2 taps for weight. A slow drag across the wrist to mean, we're being watched. These gestures became sacred, as trusted as any weapon. In quieter hours, while hidden beneath collapsed roofs, or tucked behind piles of rebar, they shared food, whispered jokes, sometimes even stories. Just enough to remind each other they were still human. But even these small luxuries were rare. Every sound risked giving away their position, and so they learned to laugh silently, to smile without moving lips, to grieve with their eyes. There are countless unnamed pairs in Soviet records, teams who never received medals, who weren't mentioned in propaganda, but whose names lived in the margins of field reports. 2-man sniper groups secured southern factory perimeter for 48 hours. That's all. But behind those dry words was a living connection built on trust so deep, it defied the fear around them. One such team, known only by first names, Artyom and Kolya, held a position near the Red October factory for 6 days straight. They slept in shifts, using a broken oil drum as shelter, rationing 1 can of meat and half a loaf of bread between them. During that time, they recorded 11 confirmed kills, disrupted 2 German supply runs, and relayed coordinates to a mortar crew using chalk marks and mirror flashes. On the 7th day, a collapsing wall separated them. Artyom was found alive 3 days later. Kolya wasn't. When asked by a commander how he survived, Artyom simply said, "Kolya made me promise I wouldn't miss." He never returned to the front after that. These stories, quiet and unseen, carried more weight among the sniper corps than medals ever could. Trust wasn't just a virtue, it was life insurance. And when the bond broke, even those who survived carried a silence that no amount of time could erase. In the next part, we'll explore how the snipers dealt with the moral cost of their role, what it meant to choose a life where killing was done with thought, calm, and clarity, and how that responsibility shaped them long after the war ended. Killing from a distance does not remove the weight of what's been done. For the snipers of Stalingrad, each confirmed kill was followed not by celebration, but by stillness. A pause, a moment of breath held too long, as if the soul itself hesitated. Unlike the chaos of the front lines, where death often came in waves and confusion, the sniper's world was intimate, deliberate, and painfully aware. Each shot was a decision. Each target had a face. Many Soviet snipers wrestled with that quiet moral burden, especially in the long, frozen hours after the smoke had cleared and the body was no longer moving. Some learned to compartmentalize, telling themselves that their target was a soldier, an invader, someone who would have killed them if given the chance. Others stared through the scope too long, watching the enemy speak, eat, gesture, human things, before pulling the trigger, and watching that moment vanish forever. The psychological cost was rarely spoken of, but it lingered. Vasily Zaitsev himself once wrote that he always remembered the first one. Not the name, not the uniform, just the way the man looked up seconds before the shot. His eyes were tired, Zaitsev wrote, and I remember thinking he looked older than he was. Such reflections were not rare. Many snipers carried journals, writing down what they saw, not just for reports but for themselves, an attempt to make sense of the unnatural balance they were forced to live with. "I killed a man today," one note read, found in the belongings of a fallen sharpshooter. "He was drinking from his canteen. I waited until he finished. I don't know why." These were not heartless assassins. These were sons, daughters, students, workers, people who, under different skies, might have been teachers, hunters, or poets. But Stalingrad made something else of them. witnesses to a war that asked for stillness and delivered sorrow. To cope, many clung to rituals. Some whispered apologies after each shot. Others carved notches into their rifles, not to count, but to remember. A few never spoke of it at all, burying the memory beneath layers of discipline. There were also those who tried to find small mercies where they could. One sniper refused to shoot soldiers who were helping the wounded, even if it cost him a tactical advantage. Another deliberately missed once a day, saying, "Even the enemy deserves to feel lucky." Yet such moments were rare luxuries. The city demanded results. Positions had to be held, streets cleared, threats eliminated. The snipers knew that with every shot not taken, someone on their side might die. So they aimed, they fired, and they moved on. But the wait came later, when the city fell quiet, when no more targets moved, when the war moved elsewhere, but the memories stayed behind. After the battle, some snipers returned to ordinary life and never spoke of what they had done. Others became instructors, passing on their knowledge with tired eyes and slow voices. A few broke entirely, unable to reconcile the calm required to survive with the humanity they had tried to protect. In the end, what separated the sniper from the soldier wasn't just distance, it was responsibility. To kill without hate, to aim without rage, to watch and decide, not in the heat of battle but in the long cold hours of stillness, required a kind of strength most never understood. And yet, in Stalingrad, that strength held the line. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the weapons themselves, the rifles that became as personal as a heartbeat, and how Soviet snipers adapted their tools to survive, thrive, and remain invisible in a city made of steel and ash. The sniper's rifle was more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline, a partner, sometimes even a mirror. In the ruined city of Stalingrad, where frost crept into every crack, and movement meant death, the relationship between a sniper and their rifle had to be close, instinctive, and deeply personal. It was not enough to know how it worked, one had to feel it. How it breathed, how it settled into the shoulder, how the trigger responded on the coldest morning. The primary rifle used by Soviet snipers during the Battle of Stalingrad was the Mosin Nagant M1891 30ths, a bolt-action rifle chambered for 7.6, 2x54 mmR ammunition. Though designed decades earlier, it was reliable, rugged, and capable of impressive accuracy in the right hands. The PU scope mounted to it gave a relatively modest 3.5x magnification. But it was enough, because in the broken landscape of Stalingrad, distances were short, and the enemy was often less than 400 meters away. Most snipers had to share their rifles with time itself. Many were old, handed down, battle-worn, with scratches on the stock and tiny carvings on the grip. Snipers cleaned them obsessively, not out of regulation, but out of necessity. A single speck of dirt could throw a shot wide. A poorly maintained bolt might jam at the worst moment. In battle, you could count on your instincts, but only if your rifle obeyed without hesitation. The scope was wrapped in cloth or smeared with soot to reduce glare. Triggers were often filed smoother, actions tightened or lubricated with homemade solutions. Some snipers wrapped the barrel in rags, both to avoid the cold metal touching bare skin, and to muffle accidental sounds when moving. Others tied strips of cloth along the stock to absorb moisture, or simply to mark the rifle as theirs. For many, the rifle was named, not in jest, but with reverence. A few common names appear again and again in recovered journals. Katya, the Eye, Little Sister. These were not decorations. These names carried comfort, focus, a reminder that the sniper was not alone. The rifle listened. It spoke. And it had to be trusted more than any commander. Ammunition was another quiet struggle. Snipers were issued special match-grade rounds when available, but often they had to make do with whatever standard issue rounds could be found. Spotters would track where shots landed, adjusting mentally for inconsistencies in powder load or bullet weight. Some snipers grew so familiar with their rifle that they could account for tiny defects just by feel. There are accounts of snipers testing bullet balance by rolling them on flat metal, checking for wobble. In the absence of precision tools, intuition became their guide. A rifle wasn't just for shooting, it was a tool for observation, a measuring stick, a companion through sleepless nights. Many snipers learned to read wind through the motion of smoke drifting past the barrel, or by holding a finger to the sky and gauging temperature shifts. They kept extra cloth near the bolt to wipe away condensation, and during long shifts they pressed their hands around the chamber just to feel warmth. And when it came time to fire, all of that preparation condensed into a single breath. Inhale, exhale, pause, squeeze. The shot broke the silence, but not the bond. It was the rifle that whispered afterward, reminding the sniper where they were, what they'd done, and that they were still alive. In the next part, we'll explore how snipers chose their hiding spots, not just for visibility or range, but for survival, and how the architecture of destruction became their greatest camouflage. In the skeletal remains of Stalingrad, where every building bore the scars of bombardment, and every corner could mean death, choosing the right hiding spot was as vital as the rifle itself. For a sniper, a position wasn't just about elevation or line of sight, it was a puzzle, a living equation made up of shadow, silence, cover, and exit. The ruins of the city became a second skin to those who lived within them. Rubble was not debris, it was opportunity. A collapsed staircase could be a ramp into a hidden corner. A broken water pipe might offer a tunnel into a factory wall. Snipers learned quickly that elevation wasn't always an advantage. Higher positions like rooftops or upper windows could offer visibility, but they also made one a target. Enemy spotters would scan high first, assuming the shooter was above. That's why many of the most successful Soviet snipers preferred mid-level positions. Second stories, half-buried basements, or holes in walls just wide enough for a barrel and a narrow field of view. The goal was always the same: see, shoot, and vanish. Sniper nests were often chosen at night or during artillery barrages, when movement could be masked by the chaos around them. A good nest had three qualities: it blended into the environment, offered a clear line of sight to a known enemy route, and had at least one escape path, often more. It was common to rig the path in with false tracks to mislead enemy scouts, or to crawl in backwards to conceal orientation. Sometimes, snipers created decoy nests, placing broken rifles or helmets in plain sight to draw fire away from their true position. In one recorded case, a sniper known as Alexei constructed an elaborate system using two chimneys in a bombed apartment block. He would fire from one, then crawl through a collapsed attic beam to the other, resetting his line of fire before the enemy had time to triangulate. German soldiers spent days shelling the first chimney. The second remained untouched. Within nests, everything had to be quiet and controlled. Loose bricks were secured with cloth, sharp edges padded, reflective surfaces darkened with soot or mud. Ventilation was critical. Snipers learned how to direct the smoke from their breath or food away from the nest's opening. Even body odor had to be considered. Some snipers rubbed dirt or ash into their clothes to reduce their scent. Sound discipline was sacred. Every movement was rehearsed, opening the scope cap, lifting the rifle, even adjusting the trigger finger. Some would remove buttons from their sleeves if they clicked too loudly. A dropped coin could cost a life. And so they trained their hands to move slowly, deliberately, always with awareness. In winter, the challenge grew. Snow betrayed everything. Footsteps, heat, even the breath from a rifle barrel. Snipers began using white camo stitched from curtains or tablecloths, lying flat for hours without moving, letting snow cover them gradually. A small hole was left for the scope, sometimes disguised with sticks or cloth. They became part of the ground, no longer men, just mounds of stillness with sharp eyes. Some nests were never reused. Once a shot was fired, it became unsafe, especially if the enemy suspected the location. That's why many teams had backup nests, pre-prepared and memorized. A successful sniper in Stalingrad often had 5 or 6 options ready at all times, rotating between them like ghosts. The city became a map not of streets but of vantage points. Not addresses but angles. Not homes, but hiding places. And in this shattered landscape, the best hiding place wasn't the highest or deepest, it was the one no one thought to look at. A crack in a wall. A broken window with one pane left. A mound of ash that hadn't moved in days. That was where the sniper waited. That was where the war stayed quiet. In the next part, we'll step into one of the most chilling tactics used by Soviet snipers. The art of patience kills, where a single enemy was watched for hours or days, and the act of not shooting became the deadliest weapon of all. Among the most feared tactics used by Soviet snipers in Stalingrad was something the soldiers came to call the ghost stare. The eerie knowledge that someone, somewhere, was watching you, choosing not to shoot. This was not hesitation, it was strategy. A form of psychological warfare that unfolded over hours or days, where a sniper identified a target but withheld the shot, not for mercy, but for maximum impact. These were known as patience kills. The idea was simple: create fear, not just death. A single well-placed shot could eliminate one man, but allowing a soldier to feel exposed, vulnerable, and hunted for an entire day could paralyze a whole squad. Soviet snipers mastered this method, learning to wait not just for a clean shot, but for the precise moment when the target's mind was fraying. One story often told in whispers among Soviet sniper circles was of a German radio operator, positioned in a small outpost near the northern tram depot. He sat alone in a sandbag shelter, visible through a narrow slit from a ruined stairwell nearly 150 meters away. The sniper assigned to observe him, no name given, watched the man for over 16 hours without firing. Through his scope, he saw the operator eating, adjusting dials, looking over his shoulder. Every few minutes the German would pause and glance toward the stairwell, as if sensing something. The sniper could have ended it at any time, but he waited. And the longer he waited, the more erratic the soldier's behavior became. By dusk, the operator abandoned his post, ran into the open, and was shot by a patrol commander for desertion. The sniper never fired a single round. This tactic was not always used, but when it was, it could be devastating. German soldiers began to fear open space not because of confirmed kills, but because of what hadn't happened yet. A helmet left untouched for hours. A window that always seemed dark. A doorway that no one dared cross. The fear became internalized. Soldiers slowed their movements, refused to speak above a whisper, delayed patrols. In military reports, commanders noted loss of unit cohesion due to sniper presence, even when no shots had been fired for days. The power of invisibility had become more destructive than bullets. Soviet snipers understood that this was not cruelty, it was control. In the frozen war zone of Stalingrad, where resources were limited and enemy reinforcements were endless, the ability to immobilize an entire unit by sight alone was worth more than a dozen fallen soldiers. Patience kills required more than just time. They required discipline, endurance, and an ability to see the mind of the enemy unraveling in real time. Snipers had to stay absolutely still, often in painful or awkward positions, letting snow build on their coats, resisting every urge to scratch, move, or blink too long. They became statues with breath. The most skilled among them said it was not about timing, it was about empathy, not compassion, but the ability to feel what the enemy felt, to predict when fear would reach its peak, when the shoulders would slump, when the eyes would dart just a little faster. That was the true shot, they said. Not with the rifle, but with the mind. Even among the Red Army's sniper instructors, This tactic was controversial. Some believed it wasted opportunities. Others taught it as an essential part of urban warfare. What is certain is that the fear it generated extended far beyond the battlefield. After the war, captured German soldiers described the sensation of being watched as unbearable. "You felt your soul was being counted down," one man wrote. "Like a clock was ticking, and you didn't know when it would stop." In the next part, we'll explore how snipers communicated across the battlefield without radios, using shadows, reflections, timed signals, and the hidden language of those who learned to speak without sound. In a battlefield like Stalingrad, where every echo could betray a position and every movement might be seen by unseen eyes, communication became its own quiet science. Sniper teams, often operating far from the front lines or embedded deep in enemy-controlled ruins, had to invent new ways to speak, not with words, but with time, shadow, and gesture. Radios were too noisy, too bulky, and often not available to individual sniper units. Even whispers could carry across broken stone and metal, magnified by silence. So the snipers developed something else, a field language built from instinct and repetition. The most basic signals were hand-based. A closed fist meant, "Stop." An open palm slowly lowered to the ground meant, "Get down." Two fingers pointed sideways meant, "Movement left." A slow circle drawn in the air meant, "Prepare to relocate." These signs were universal among many sniper teams, passed down by instructors, or learned intuitively by survival. But the most skilled teams went far beyond that. Some used mirrored flashes to communicate across long distances, blinking brief messages in Morse code or pre-agreed patterns. Others arranged broken glass or bits of metal in specific formations on windowsills to signal safe paths or nearby threats. One pair, operating near the Red October steel plant, used a pigeon as a decoy. They tied a small string around its leg, then tugged it slightly from behind cover to make it flutter. If it flew, it meant danger had passed. If it sat still, they waited. Shadows became another language. In the soft light of dusk, or the blue haze of dawn, a sniper might tilt a board, or shift a curtain ever so slightly to cast a signal across rubble, a flicker on the wall. A quick beam of light caught through a rifle scope. It was enough. Sniper instructors also taught the concept of timed silence, agreeing on intervals in which nothing would happen, and then using the absence of a shot or a movement as a message itself. If nothing occurred in 3 minutes, it meant, hold. If a shot rang out at exactly 2 minutes, it meant, target confirmed. In this way, communication became part of the rhythm of the environment, like a heartbeat hidden in the noise of a dying city. There were physical signals too. Chalk marks left on doorways, 3 stacked bricks near a stairwell, a glove tied to a pole with the thumb pointing left. These weren't random. Each had meaning, recorded in quiet minds and used only once before disappearing. Some snipers even used scent, smearing grease or kerosene in doorways to indicate cleared paths or recent movement. It wasn't precise, but it worked. In rare cases, a network of sniper teams would operate in coordination across several blocks, rotating positions to confuse the enemy. Spotters carried messages between nests, disguised as civilians or stretcher bearers. They would tap a heel 3 times when entering a new nest, the signal that they were friendly. Instructors placed great emphasis on improvisation. Every team was encouraged to develop their own system, one based not on rigid code, but on familiarity. After weeks in the field, a sniper and spotter could read each other's breathing. A held breath might signal that danger was near. A slow exhale meant readiness. When bullets weren't flying, it was the space between breaths that mattered most. And perhaps that was the heart of it, learning to exist in silence so completely that even your thoughts could travel without sound. The battlefield was loud, yes, but the sniper's world thrived in the stillness beneath that noise. In the next part, We'll examine the changing weather during the winter siege, and how snow, ice, and fog became both allies and enemies to those hiding with rifles in the ruins. The winter of 1942 in Stalingrad was not just cold, it was merciless, punishing, and transformative. The snow did not fall gently, it came down in jagged flurries, driven sideways by wind that cut through uniforms and skin with equal cruelty. Temperatures dropped to -30°C, sometimes even lower at night, and the city became encased in a frozen silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. For the soldiers who fought and died there, and especially for the snipers who lay still for hours, the cold was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the snow offered cover. It softened sound, concealed movement, and blanketed the wreckage in a white veil that made it harder to spot subtle changes. A sniper dressed in improvised winter camouflage, bedsheets, curtain scraps, old flour sacks, could disappear entirely into a snowy pile of bricks, or a roof draped in frost. Their breath crystallized in front of their face, but if they timed it carefully, they could shoot between exhalations to avoid giving away their position. But the snow also betrayed them. It clung to boots, marked every footstep, crunched under the wrong kind of weight. A fresh trail in untouched snow could lead an enemy straight to their hiding place, and even crawling left patterns, compressions visible from rooftops or higher vantage points. Some snipers learned to walk backwards, brushing their trail with twigs. Others moved at night, during flurries, when their path would vanish within minutes. The ice was worse. It made even the steadiest hands tremble, turned rifles brittle, and froze fingers to metal. To avoid skin freezing to the trigger or barrel, many wrapped their rifles in cloth, even using strips torn from their own coats. They rubbed ash or oil into their palms, blew warm breath into their gloves, or kept their hands buried until the moment they needed to fire. The cold was always there, not just in the air but in the bones. It crept into their joints, slowed their thoughts, made every breath a decision. Food froze. Canned meat became blocks. Water had to be carried inside coats, close to the chest, to remain drinkable. And sleep, when it came, was dangerous. Too long in one position without movement, and frostbite took fingers, toes, even ears. A few snipers lost entire days of work simply from the cold, seizing their rifles bolt shut. But still, the winter gave something in return: time. The fog that rolled in from the Volga in early morning became a curtain. The long, dark nights allowed more movement under cover. The whiteout conditions meant that shots could be fired and then the shooter could vanish without a trace. One sniper, known only as Nikita, was said to have taken down 5 men in a single blizzard, moving unseen from post to post, while the wind howled loud enough to mask even gunfire. No one ever found his exact positions, just shell casings buried in snow. The weather also had an emotional toll. The cold isolated everyone, even comrades. It made conversation rare, expression painful, smiles froze on faces, laughter disappeared. The snipers felt this isolation more deeply than most, alone in nests, wrapped in rags, eyes stinging from wind and frost, hours passing with no sign of life. And when a shot was finally fired, it echoed longer, louder, sharper than ever before, the crack bouncing off frozen walls like a scream. Some described those shots as feeling too loud, too final. But they kept firing, they kept waiting, they kept disappearing into the storm. Because in Stalingrad, winter wasn't just a season, it was a weapon. In the next part, we'll explore how young volunteers, some barely out of school, were trained as snipers in crash courses, and how their innocence vanished as fast as their breath in the frozen city. They came from schools, from farms, from factories, barely old enough to carry a rifle yet already marked by war. In the desperate days of the Stalingrad siege, as casualties mounted, and the demand for precision fighters grew, the Soviet command began pulling from the youngest layers of the population. Boys of 16. Girls with braids tucked under helmets. Many had never fired a weapon before they arrived, and within a week, they would be holding a scope and learning how to end a life. These youth snipers weren't created through long academies or structured military education. They were forged quickly, often in shattered buildings just behind the lines, by instructors who had survived long enough to pass on what mattered. The crash courses in sniping were brutal in their focus. There was no time for theory or ideology, only skill, silence, and survival. The trainees were given old Mosin nagants, sometimes without scopes, and told to memorize every part by touch. They practiced crawling through rubble, wrapping their rifles in cloth, adjusting their breath to the rhythm of wind and heartbeat. Instructors shouted rarely. They whispered. The war was too close for anything louder. One of the most famous instructors was a man named Stefan Ilyich, who had already lost 2 of his own students to enemy snipers. He was known for testing new recruits by tossing a tin can 30 meters away and asking them to hit it, without raising their elbows off the floor. Those who missed were not scolded, they were told simply, "You would be dead." Under his training, students learned how to build nests from nothing, how to time a shot between artillery booms, how to recognize a German helmet from the shape of a shadow. But the hardest lesson came not from the rifle, but from the waiting. Patience was drilled into them. Some teenagers, excited and trembling, wanted to prove themselves with quick shots. They were made to lie in silence for hours, staring at nothing, taught to feel the weight of time itself. "You'll shoot when you stop needing to," Stepan told them, "not before." Among the young recruits was a girl named Polina, 17, with sharp eyes and hands that trembled only when she wasn't holding a rifle. She had joined after her older brother disappeared in the early days of the siege. Within her first month she recorded 5 kills. But she didn't speak of them. Instead, she asked questions about wind, about metal fatigue, about how to keep frost from blurring her scope. She was obsessed not with death, but with precision. The veterans noticed. They watched her. And when a respected sniper named Mikhail was wounded, Polina took his place for a week, covering a key sector near a ruined textile factory. She didn't miss a single shot. The German unit opposite that position was relocated days later. These young snipers often worked in pairs with older spotters, creating unlikely partnerships: age and youth, discipline and fire. The elders taught calm, the youth brought speed. It wasn't uncommon to see a gray-haired man guiding a teenage girl through a scope alignment, both wrapped in the same tattered coat, both speaking in the language of silence. The loss rate among these recruits was high. Some didn't survive their first mission, but others adapted with startling speed. The war aged them quickly. Faces grew hollow, voices quiet. Childhood, if it remained at all, was buried beneath snow and stone. And yet, in the moments between missions, these youth sometimes sketched in the margins of their notebooks. They wrote poems. Polina once carved a rose into the stock of her rifle, not for beauty, for memory, because even when death surrounded them, something soft still flickered behind their eyes. In the next part, we'll turn to the German perspective, how Wehrmacht soldiers experienced the sniper threat, and how it altered their behavior, morale, and view of the invisible enemy they called the Whispering Death. To the average German infantryman fighting in the rubble of Stalingrad, the sniper threat was not just a danger, it was a constant presence, a psychological shadow that followed them through every hallway, trench, and street. The Soviet sniper wasn't seen as a soldier in the traditional sense, but something else, an invisible force, a predator, a mind hiding behind glass and steel. Soldiers began referring to the snipers with whispered nicknames: ghosts, rats, the Whispering Death. Some called them the Eyes of Stalin. Others didn't call them anything at all, afraid that naming them might make them more real. From the moment German troops stepped into the city, they were told to assume they were being watched. The snipers had made sure of that. Patrols changed behavior almost immediately. Movements became slower, tighter, more uncertain. Officers began crawling across open ground, using mirrors to check windows, sending lower-ranking soldiers ahead first. Whole squads waited for pigeons to scatter or rats to flee before stepping into a building, hoping the animals might detect what they couldn't. The effects went beyond the battlefield. Morale reports found in post-war archives show that fear of snipers caused more delays than Soviet artillery. In one district alone, it was noted that a single Soviet sniper immobilized movement between sectors for over 24 hours. No one knew where he was. No shots had been fired. But no one dared move. It was this kind of terror, precise, calculated, and entirely silent, that wore down even the most hardened troops. German snipers were deployed in greater numbers to counter the threat, but many found themselves outmatched in unfamiliar terrain. Soviet sharpshooters used their city like a second skin. They knew how light reflected off broken glass at noon. They knew the wind patterns between buildings. German marksmen, though well trained, lacked that connection to the ground. One account from a German Obergefreiter tells of a 3-day standoff with a sniper believed to be hiding in a water tower. His unit fired mortars, machine guns, even called in tanks to level the structure. When they finally approached, they found nothing, just empty shell casings and a carved message on a brick. Too late. The psychological impact didn't end there. Some German soldiers began seeing snipers where there were none. A flicker in the window. A glint of metal. A coat draped over rubble. False alarms multiplied. Whole buildings were shelled based on rumors. Ammunition was wasted. Nerves frayed. At night, many soldiers reported hearing phantom shots. Cracks in the darkness that were never confirmed, but left men clutching their rifles in silence, waiting for a bullet that never came. Officers tried to downplay the fear. They issued strict rules for movement, ordered troops to avoid predictable paths, and circulated stories about captured or killed Soviet snipers to boost confidence. But on the ground, the fear remained. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered through bricks and echo, through every window left ajar. One soldier wrote in a letter home, "I would rather charge a machine gun than cross an open street here. At least with the gun you see it." For many, the sniper wasn't a person. It was a condition of the city, a part of the air. You breathed it in. You adjusted to it. You feared it, even when you tried not to. And that fear, more than any bullet, was the true weapon of the Soviet sniper. In the next part, we'll look at how snipers operated in the sewers and underground systems of Stalingrad, how darkness became their greatest ally, and how the war beneath the city mirrored the war above it. Beneath the shattered buildings and frozen rubble of Stalingrad lay another battlefield, a world of darkness, rot, and silent movement. The sewer systems, utility tunnels, and forgotten basements beneath the city formed a vast and often overlooked network that became one of the most effective tools of survival and ambush for Soviet sniper teams. While most soldiers fought and died in the open, the most skilled sharpshooters learned to use the underground to disappear, reposition, and reappear like ghosts. These tunnels were far from ideal. They were filled with freezing water, broken pipes, collapsed ceilings, and sometimes even the remains of earlier battles. But for those who dared to move through them, they offered the most valuable resource in urban warfare: unpredictability. Enemy scouts might monitor rooftops and streets, but few were prepared for a sniper to emerge from a hole beneath their feet. The Soviets referred to these routes simply as hody, or ways. They weren't mapped, at least not formally. Knowledge of them was passed along quietly between units, scribbled on scraps of paper, or shared in whispers before missions. Some tunnels led to basements of half-standing buildings. Others connected factories or supply stations. A few simply ended in dead, flooded chambers. But the ones that mattered were memorized, practiced, and used to devastating effect. Sniper teams often used these tunnels for entry and escape. A shooter might fire from a nest built into a basement window, then vanish into the darkness minutes later, reappearing in another block entirely. German forces would arrive too late, finding only the echo of a rifle, and perhaps a shell casing frozen into the floor. It was in these underground paths that many of the most legendary ambushes took place. There's one account of a sniper spotter pair who spent 2 nights in a flooded tunnel beneath a tram station, waiting for a German patrol to enter the building above. When the moment came, they emerged silently, fired 3 precise shots from within the shadows of a broken grate, and disappeared again into the sewer before the enemy could respond. No footsteps, no shouting, just silence. And it was silence that defined these places. The deeper snipers went underground. The more they had to rely on instinct and nonverbal cues. Flashlights were too risky. Noise echoed in strange ways, sometimes louder than expected. Communication came in the form of hand pressure, taps on shoulders or timed movement. Even breathing was controlled, measured, kept shallow. One step too loud could give everything away. The conditions were horrific. The smell of sewage, rot and burning oil filled the lungs. Rats were constant companions. Some snipers wrapped cloth around their faces, not just for warmth or concealment, but to block the stench. And yet, in the most counterintuitive way, it was within these depths that many soldiers felt safest. Out of the wind, out of the line of fire, wrapped in darkness. Some even wrote about the tunnels as if they were living things, protective, secretive, sacred. One sniper, named Pavel, called them the veins of the city, saying that, quote, "The sewers know who they shelter." For German troops, the underground posed an unpredictable threat. Mines were laid, ambushes sprung, grenades tossed into dark openings never guaranteed a clear path. Flamethrowers were sometimes used to purge tunnel systems, but this only made the resistance angrier, more determined. In time, German soldiers came to fear manholes as much as windows. The idea that the enemy could rise up from beneath the earth, cold, silent and precise, was too much for some to process. The war above was chaotic and loud. The war below was slow, cold and suffocating. And for Soviet snipers, it was a realm where they had the advantage. In the next part, we'll explore how sniper tactics evolved over time, how early improvisation gave way to coordinated doctrine, and how the lessons of Stalingrad shaped sniper warfare for decades to come. At the beginning of the sniper war in Stalingrad, tactics were driven more by instinct and necessity than by doctrine. Shooters crawled through ruins with borrowed rifles, learned from bitter experience, and relied on the few veterans who had survived longer than a few weeks. But as the siege wore on, and sniper teams proved again and again their strategic value, what began as individual improvisation slowly evolved into a more organized and formalized system. The Soviet High Command recognized the potential of these quiet killers, not just as frontline support, but as psychological weapons. Entire streets had been cleared, enemy patrols slowed, and officers removed with surgical precision, all by men and women who fired only when necessary. The Red Army decided it was time to build a system around what had worked so far. Sniper schools were officially established within the city. Makeshift classrooms set up in the ruins of schools, factories, and even old cinemas. Veteran snipers like Vasily Zaitsev were assigned to teach the next generation, passing on their hard-earned skills to young recruits in courses that combined shooting drills, stealth techniques, and mental endurance. These lessons were taught with urgency. Every day the city claimed more lives, and the faster a sniper could be trained, the sooner they could return to the battlefield. The core of Soviet sniper doctrine focused on 3 things: patience, position, and psychology. Patience meant learning to wait, not just minutes, but hours, sometimes days, for the right moment to fire. Position meant using the urban terrain not simply as cover, but as camouflage, choosing spots that could not be easily guessed or countered. Psychology meant understanding how the enemy would respond to fear, and using that fear to control movement, slow advances, and disrupt morale. The doctrine also emphasized teamwork. No sniper worked alone unless absolutely necessary. The shooter-spotter model became standard. The spotter's role was elevated, not just as a second pair of eyes, but as a navigator, a security layer, and sometimes a moral compass. The spotter kept time, monitored surroundings, and watched the shooter for signs of fatigue or emotional strain. Each team was trained to move, communicate, and think as one. Special emphasis was placed on reconnaissance. Snipers were taught to study their terrain thoroughly, measuring distances by pacing, memorizing patterns in debris, observing how light moved across surfaces during the day. They were taught how to use mirrors, water reflections, and even animal behavior to detect enemy presence. An overturned trash bin might mean a new patrol route. Birds flying from a rooftop might signal movement below. Every detail mattered. Ammunition was treated like gold. Every shot had to count. Misses weren't just failures. They were potential death sentences, revealing the sniper's location. Recruits were drilled relentlessly on breathing, trigger control, and recoil management. Instructors often placed coins on the barrel of the rifle and demanded that the shooter fire without letting it fall. Beyond technical skill, the doctrine encouraged mental resilience. Snipers were trained to manage hunger, cold, fatigue, and isolation. They practiced going without food for a day, remaining motionless for hours, staying awake through entire nights. This wasn't cruelty. It was preparation for a war that had no comfort. As the system matured, sniper teams began to operate in more coordinated ways. They were assigned sectors, built overlapping fields of fire, and even supported infantry assaults by pinning down machine gun crews or targeting radio operators. They became part of the city's nervous system, a silent, invisible layer of defense. By early 1943, sniper tactics had reached a level of efficiency that impressed even Soviet commanders. Reports showed that in some districts, one sniper team could delay or stop an entire enemy unit for a full day. Kill counts were tracked, but commanders learned to value disruption just as much as elimination. The enemy was not just being killed, it was being slowed, broken, and made to feel hunted. In the next part, we'll look at the legendary sniper duels, rare deadly chess matches between masters of camouflage and patience, and how these one-on-one encounters became the stuff of whispered legend on both sides. Among the thousands of stories buried in the rubble of Stalingrad, few carry the same weight and mythos as the sniper duels. Moments where war narrowed to two human beings, both unseen, both deadly, locked in a contest of patience and nerves. These encounters didn't happen every day. Most sniper kills were one-sided, sudden, invisible. But when one sniper realized they were being hunted by another, everything changed. The rules of war collapsed into something slower, colder, more psychological. In Stalingrad, these duels were rare, but unforgettable. One of the most famous stories, of course, centers around Vasily Zaitsev and the so-called Major Koenig, a German sniper allegedly sent from Berlin to eliminate him. While the full truth of that specific duel remains debated by historians, some calling it propaganda, others affirming its plausibility, the story reflects something real: the intense mental warfare that defined sniper versus sniper engagements. These duels could last hours, or even days. It was not uncommon for both shooters to spot each other's rough position and then wait in silence, neither daring to move, each hoping the other would make the first mistake. One twitch, one blink, one moment of distraction could be fatal. The sniper duel was never about who had the better weapon. It was about who could remain still the longest, who understood the city better, who had trained their mind to function under pressure without a heartbeat's hesitation. These were not action scenes. There was no music, no movement, just frost forming on scopes, breath shallow beneath scarves, and minds turning every noise into a possible death sentence. Spotters played a critical role in these duels. In some cases, they were the only reason the sniper survived. Their job was to watch everything, not just the enemy, but their partner. If the sniper's breath grew uneven, if a hand trembled, The spotter would offer a word, a squeeze on the shoulder, a signal that said, "Stay with me." There are quiet tales passed down between Soviet veterans about these moments. One tells of a sniper named Andrei, who engaged in a duel near the city's central train station. The enemy had set up inside a wrecked signal tower, and Andrei, hidden under floorboards in a collapsed ticket booth, waited. He never saw the German's face, only a brief shimmer on broken glass. For 14 hours, neither man moved. When night came, Andrei fired a single shot into the darkness, not at the enemy, but at a metal beam nearby, hoping to draw a response. The German fired back, missing by inches. That was the mistake. Andrei's second shot ended the duel, but when he reached the tower, the German was gone. Blood, shell casings. No body, just absence. This too was part of the sniper mythos. Uncertainty. The idea that your enemy might still be out there, wounded, watching. Some duels ended without a shot. Snipers realized they were too evenly matched and withdrew. Others ended with both dead, shooting within seconds of each other. And some were never known at all, buried in reports as enemy sniper neutralized, with no mention of the hours spent in frozen silence beforehand. These duels became legend, not because they were glamorous, but because they represented the purest form of mental warfare. Two minds, two bodies, no room for error. They were not fought for revenge or medals. They were fought because one sniper knew that the only threat to him was someone like him. In the next part, we'll shift our attention to what happened after the battle. How the surviving Soviet snipers tried to return to ordinary life, and whether peace was ever truly possible after seeing the world through a scope for so long. When the Battle of Stalingrad finally ended in February 1943, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the aftermath of something so destructive, so total, that even those who survived found themselves unsure of what survival meant. For Soviet snipers, who had spent months in frozen nests, watching the world through narrow scopes, the transition back to ordinary life, or even to standard infantry duties, was not smooth. Many of them had entered the sniper corps as young recruits, full of resolve, carrying stories of lost family, ruined homes, and a burning need to act. Now they carried something else, an invisible weight that did not lift with the victory. The Red Army hailed its sniper heroes with awards and newspaper articles. Vasily Zaitsev became a household name. Others, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Rosa Shanina, were used as symbols of Soviet resilience and discipline. But the vast majority of Stalingrad snipers never saw a camera or a medal. They simply moved on, many to new fronts, some to hospitals, and some to grave silence. What did it mean to return from that kind of role? In interviews conducted years later, some veterans described the days after Stalingrad as more disorienting than the battle itself. One sniper recalled walking through a train station and instinctively calculating vantage points, looking for high ground and choke points, even though there was no threat. Another said she had trouble speaking above a whisper for weeks. Her voice, she explained, had simply adapted to the silence and didn't know how to come back. For some, the rifles stayed with them. Not in their hands, but in memory. They could still feel the weight of it, the cold of the barrel, the way it pressed into their cheek as they aimed. Others wanted nothing more to do with weapons. A few destroyed their rifles after the war, unable to bear the idea of what they had done with them. There were no therapy programs, no understanding of post-traumatic stress. The Soviet Union expected its heroes to be stoic, composed, focused on reconstruction. But inside, many snipers carried the faces they'd seen through their scopes. The German soldiers drinking from canteens, reading letters, adjusting helmets, moments frozen forever. For some, the only way to cope was to keep serving. Many became instructors, passing on their knowledge to new generations of soldiers. They taught patience, discipline, the ethics of when not to fire. In their lessons, there was both pride and regret. Others returned to civilian life, factory work, farming, school. But even there, the habits of the war followed them. They avoided open windows. They sat facing doorways. They noticed small movements across the street. At night, they heard phantom gunshots, not always loud, sometimes just a soft click in the dark that woke them from sleep. Despite the silence, some snipers tried to speak through writing. A few left behind journals, fragments of thought carved into notebooks, or recorded years later. "I don't know their names," one wrote. "But I remember how they looked through the scope. Some blinked, some didn't. I remember the moment before. I try not to remember the moment after." But not all reflections were painful. A number of veterans said they felt they had done what had to be done. That they had defended their home, their people, their city. They hadn't chased glory. They had simply watched, waited, and protected. And that belief, however heavy, gave them a kind of peace. The city of Stalingrad would be rebuilt. Streets renamed. Statues raised. But for the snipers who had once controlled those streets from the shadows, the real monument remained in memory. Of days spent in stillness. Of lives weighed carefully before being taken. And of a war that demanded silence as much as it did courage. In the next part, we'll revisit the story of Vasily Zaitsev, what became of him after the battle, and how his legend was shaped by history, politics, and his own quiet reflections. By the time the battle was over, Vasily Zaitsev had already become a legend. His name had been printed in Pravda, his confirmed kills counted with reverence, and his quiet demeanor turned into a symbol of Soviet precision and discipline. But Zaitsev, the man, was not a myth. He was a soldier, calm, methodical, and deeply aware of the cost of what he had done. Born in the Urals and raised in the hunting traditions of the taiga, Vasily brought into the war a calmness that many mistook for coldness. In truth, it was survival. His experience at Stalingrad, reportedly over 200 confirmed kills, though the exact number has been debated, was not marked by arrogance or bloodlust, but by quiet focus. Zaitsev never glamorized what he did. He taught others. He adapted. And when the battle shifted, he moved with it. After the fighting in Stalingrad, Zaitsev was wounded. An artillery shell explosion caused serious damage to his eyes. For a while it was believed he might go blind. But with the help of a specialist and careful treatment, his sight was saved, and he returned not to the front lines, but to instruction. He spent much of the remainder of the war training new snipers, passing on his experience, correcting small habits, and emphasizing above all the importance of patience and ethical responsibility. "You must know why you shoot," he was quoted saying. "You must know what your bullet is stopping, and what it will never undo." In 1943, he was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. His story was retold in newspapers, books, and even adapted, later, decades later, into film. But Zaitsev himself remained a quiet figure. After the war, he transitioned into civilian life, working in factories and eventually becoming the director of a textile plant in Kiev. He rarely spoke publicly about Stalingrad. Those who knew him described a kind man, private, serious, and humble. Not a man chasing fame. Not a man seeking recognition. In his later years he did grant occasional interviews, often focused more on honoring fallen comrades than recounting his own actions. He spoke about his students, those who lived, and those who didn't. He mentioned the sniper schools, the tactics, the duels. But always, the stories ended with silence. "There are things I remember clearly," he once said, "and things I choose not to." In 1985, he was honored again for his service, and in 2001, long after his death in 1991, his remains were reburied in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, according to his last wish, to rest beside his fellow soldiers. His tombstone bears his name and a rifle carved into the stone. No inscription about his kills. No dramatic epitaph. Just a quiet remembrance of a man who did his duty in a city that devoured thousands. The legend of Zaitsev, like many wartime icons, grew larger than life. Films portrayed him as a lone hunter, locked in a cinematic duel with a German rival. Stories sharpened over time, shaped by politics, propaganda, and the hunger for heroes. But the truth was simpler. Zaitsev was not extraordinary because of his kill count. He was extraordinary because he remained human in a role that threatened to strip that away. He trained others not to be machines, but to be thoughtful, aware, and responsible. He respected his targets, not in admiration, but in acknowledgement of their shared position in a war neither of them had chosen. His legacy is not just in the bullets fired but in the lives shaped, those he trained, those he inspired, and those who, years later, still study his calmness under pressure as a model of discipline. In the next part, we'll dive into the female snipers who followed after the Battle of Stalingrad, women who learned from veterans like Zaitsev and carried forward the tactics, courage, and clarity into the later stages of the war. As the war dragged on beyond Stalingrad, the Red Army expanded its sniper programs across the Eastern Front, and among the most effective and respected marksmen were women, many of whom had drawn their first inspiration from the defenders of Stalingrad. These were not exceptions or propaganda tools. They were trained, tested, and feared. And they weren't new to the war. Soviet women had already proven themselves in the skies as pilots, in hospitals as combat medics, and on the front lines as machine gunners and sappers. But in the world of snipers, they discovered something uniquely suited to their strengths: calm, precision, focus, and a near impossible ability to endure discomfort. Women snipers were often praised by instructors for their steadiness under pressure. They fired more patiently, moved more quietly, and adapted faster to harsh conditions. They were also, perhaps surprisingly to some at the time, more emotionally detached during missions. Not because they lacked empathy, but because they viewed each shot as an act of defense, not aggression. Many of them carried personal loss into their rifles, lost brothers, fathers, cities. One of the most famous was Rosa Shunina, born in the Arkhangelsk region. Trained after the model of Zaitsev's sniper schools, she showed exceptional skill early in her military career. Quiet, slender, and with a sharp, intelligent gaze, Rosa soon became known for her bravery under fire and her talent for counter-sniping. She reportedly preferred to take her shots while standing or kneeling, riskier positions that allowed for quicker movement and better sightlines. Her confidence in the field became legendary. Shunina kept a journal, one that would later reveal not just the tactical thoughts of a soldier, but the internal reflections of a young woman who understood the cost of what she was doing. "I can't kill a man twice," she once wrote, "but I must shoot. I do it for the ones we lost." Her total confirmed kills were over 50, many of them in close combat, and she was awarded the Order of Glory for her courage. Tragically, she was killed in action in 1945 at the age of 20, shielding a wounded commander from enemy fire. Rosa's story is not unique. Dozens of women snipers passed through the Soviet sniper schools, some of them forming all-female sniper units. These groups would often be deployed in pairs or small squads, tasked with holding sections of the front, disrupting enemy movement, and supporting infantry attacks. They learned to move at night, to find the safest nests, and to disappear before anyone realized where the shots had come from. Their gender at times was an advantage. Many German units underestimated the presence or effectiveness of female snipers, assuming they were medics or auxiliaries. That mistake cost them dearly. There are records of female sniper teams eliminating high-ranking officers, neutralizing machine gun nests, and covering the retreat of entire battalions under pressure. Their impact wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. They showed the Red Army that courage had no gender, and they reminded the enemy that fear had no face. The Soviet Union did not send these women to the front lightly. They were tested, trained, and trusted, and they earned that trust, shot by shot. After the war, some of them returned home to quiet lives. Others continued in military service or became teachers and mentors to younger generations. But many carried their stories silently, speaking only when asked, often downplaying their role, as if the memory itself were too sharp to touch. The women of the Sniper Corps are not always remembered in the same breath as their male counterparts, but their presence was felt, on the battlefield, and in the legacy they left behind. In the next part, we'll return to the streets of Stalingrad for a moment, to look at one particularly brutal sniper sector, known by both sides as the Alley of Death, and the stories that came out of that narrow, blood-soaked corridor. In a city already swallowed by violence and rubble, there were places that stood out even among the horror, locations so lethal, so relentlessly contested, that they developed nicknames whispered by soldiers on both sides. One of the most infamous was a stretch of broken pavement and twisted tram rails in the southern sector of the city, not far from the ruins of a shattered schoolhouse and an old bread factory. The Soviets called it Pereolok Smrti, and the Germans referred to it simply as Der Todgang. Both names meant the same thing, the Alley of Death. This narrow corridor, no more than 30 meters wide, had once been an ordinary street between residential blocks. But during the siege it became a killing field, an exposed connector between two Soviet positions that had to be crossed regularly to resupply, communicate, or reinforce troops. The Germans knew this. They positioned machine guns, mortars, and, most devastating of all, snipers to cover it from every angle. Any movement in the alley during daylight was almost certainly fatal. Yet the Red Army had no choice. There were no alternative paths. Dozens of Soviet soldiers died attempting to cross it in the early weeks, and soon, the alley took on a reputation not just as a tactical nightmare, but as a test of will. The Soviet response was brutal, brilliant, and entirely in the spirit of the sniper war. They began deploying their best sniper teams to reclaim the alley. Not to hold it, but to haunt it. The ruins of the bakery became a nest. A collapsed trolley served as a hiding place. The broken windows of the schoolhouse, shattered at just the right height, became ideal firing positions. And so, a sniper's duel began, not between individuals, but between philosophies of control. Every day, new sniper pairs were rotated into the zone. Their task wasn't to keep it safe, that was impossible, but to make the alley deadly for the enemy as well, to ensure that if Soviet soldiers died there, so would Germans. One team, known only by their initials, S&D, held a position near the tram tracks for nearly 72 hours without sleep. They crawled into the ruins through a drainage pipe, brought only one blanket between them, and subsisted on 2 tins of meat and melted snow. Over those 3 days, they confirmed 6 kills and halted a German patrol long enough for reinforcements to cross under cover of darkness. They were never decorated. Their story was told only years later by one of their spotters who survived the war. In this narrow world, tactics grew increasingly desperate and creative. German snipers tried using mannequins to bait out fire. The Soviets responded by attaching grenades to bricks, triggered by wires that would pull when disturbed. Both sides began to recognize the alley not as a street, but as a symbol of control, of pride, of psychological dominance. Even when the front line shifted, and the larger battle moved on, units returned to the Alley of Death like it was sacred ground. Not because it was strategically essential. By midwinter, other routes had opened, but because neither side wanted to surrender the fear it inspired. Crossing the alley became a rite of passage. Survivors told stories in hushed tones. One sergeant reportedly refused a promotion because it meant leaving the sector. "I know this hell," he said. "Better the devil I see than the one I don't." In the aftermath, few maps mark the alley. It has no commemorative plaque, but among Soviet snipers, it became a defining memory, a place where every brick mattered, where every shadow might kill, and where silence was louder than gunfire. In the next part, we'll examine the ways snipers used deception, not just camouflage, but psychological manipulation, dummy equipment, and feints, to lure the enemy into making fatal mistakes. In a war where a single wrong movement could mean death, deception became just as powerful as the bullet itself. Soviet snipers, operating in one of the most hostile and unforgiving urban battlefields in history, quickly learned that success often came not from speed or aggression, but from misdirection. From convincing the enemy to look the wrong way, hesitate at the wrong moment, or expose themselves when they believed it was safe. The use of decoys, tricks, and psychological manipulation became a defining part of sniper tactics in Stalingrad. One of the most common techniques was the deployment of dummy heads, helmets filled with sand or carved from wood, perched carefully on sticks, bricks, or bent steel bars. These heads were slowly raised above parapets, windowsills, or shell craters to tempt a reaction. German snipers, eager to confirm a hit, would fire, exposing their own position. Within seconds, the Soviet sniper, waiting nearby with rifle already aimed, would deliver the real shot. The duels that followed were often over in less than 10 seconds. Instructors taught these tactics deliberately. Recruits practiced setting traps using mannequins or even corpses posed as if alive, placed in exposed areas to study how the enemy responded. Sometimes, snipers would fire a shot into the air and then wait, counting the seconds until the enemy moved. The more patient the enemy, the deeper the lesson. But not all deception was visual. Sounds played a role too. In certain ruins, where echo distorted perception, Soviet snipers would drag metal or tap rifle stock softly to simulate movement on one side of a building, while the real threat prepared to fire from another. Spotters were trained to mimic footsteps by dragging cloth over broken tiles, or to knock rubble deliberately to create false movement patterns. This kind of psychological pressure, forcing the enemy to divide attention, to doubt their own senses, was often more effective than the rifle. One sniper unit near the Zaritsa Gorge became infamous for its use of shadow and light. They rigged mirrors scavenged from wrecked homes to reflect sunlight into empty windows, drawing fire from nervous Germans. The shots revealed enemy nests, and within minutes the snipers would reposition and strike from angles no one had anticipated. In one report, a German officer described the experience. "It is like chasing ghosts who control the weather. You fire, and then you die, and no one knows why." Soviet snipers also learned to manipulate the enemy's expectations. They deliberately left false trails, boot prints leading into dead ends, cigarette butts placed in doorways to suggest recent occupation, or even bloody rags dragged through snow to simulate injury. These small details created narratives in the minds of the enemy, stories that caused hesitation, altered decisions, and opened opportunities. Some of the most daring deceptions involved movement itself. A sniper might crawl across an alley in full view, exposed, visible, almost inviting a shot. But it wasn't the sniper. It was a spotter, wearing the same coat, drawing attention while the shooter remained still, focused, watching. In the confusion that followed, the real kill would come from an unexpected direction. Of course, these tactics were not without risk. Mistakes happened. Traps failed. Sometimes the enemy didn't take the bait, and the sniper was left exposed. Sometimes, a clever German marksman would anticipate the decoy and use it against the Soviet team. But in the high-stakes chess-like game of sniper warfare, every move mattered. Every trick added another layer to the silence. The goal was not always to kill. It was to control, to predict, to break the rhythm of the enemy's thinking. The longer you could keep them guessing, the more likely they were to make the final, fatal mistake. In the next part, we'll look at the emotional toll these mind games took on the snipers themselves, how living inside a world of illusions, traps, and waiting changed the way they thought, slept, and saw the world beyond their scope. It's easy to speak of snipers as symbols, silent, patient, deadly. But behind the rifles and strategies were human beings, many of them young, many of them alone for hours or even days at a time, and all of them subject to a psychological strain that ran deeper than the cold or the hunger. Living in constant silence, surrounded by death, playing endless games of anticipation and deception, it shaped their minds in ways few could understand. Snipers in Stalingrad weren't just killers, they were observers. Every mission required intense concentration. Every hour spent staring through a scope demanded not only physical stillness, but mental rigidity. Over time, their thoughts slowed, matched the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Many snipers described a strange kind of detachment. The world outside the scope began to blur, lose focus. Only what was inside the lens mattered. And when the mission ended, that narrow focus often lingered. Simple conversations felt distant. Faces seemed less real than the ones seen through glass. Returning to camp, or to a shelter, or even just to others, voices sometimes brought discomfort, rather than relief. One sniper, writing in a post-war diary, confessed that after several weeks in the ruins, I stopped reacting to sound. People would speak, and I would hear it, but I didn't know how to answer. My thoughts were still out there, in the streets, with the wind and the broken glass. Sleep was difficult. The discipline required to stay motionless for long periods created tension in the body that didn't fade easily. Many snipers suffered from severe insomnia, and even when sleep came, it was restless, haunted by flashes of movement, the imagined click of a scope cap, the echo of a shot that hadn't been fired. Some veterans recalled dreaming in fragments, as if their minds were still scanning for targets. Others reported waking up in a panic, convinced they had been spotted, only to find themselves lying in a bunk surrounded by silence. There were emotional consequences too. Many carried guilt, not just over the kills themselves, but over how calmly they had done it. Some feared what it meant about them, that they could watch a man through a scope for hours, study him, feel the moment of decision arrive, and pull the trigger without flinching. For others, the guilt came not from the act but from its repetition. The first time you shoot you remember, one sniper said. The 10th time, you forget. That's worse. Camaraderie helped. The sniper-spotter relationship became a rare space of trust and comfort. These pairs often became closer than brothers, sharing not only danger, but silence, small victories, and quiet fear. They helped each other remain human, in a role that slowly stripped that away. When one died, the survivor often didn't speak for days. Some refused to take new partners. Others named their rifles after the ones they'd lost. It was their way of keeping something steady in a world that no longer made sense. Propaganda painted snipers as heroes. The press celebrated their kill counts, showed photos of medals and clean uniforms. But inside, many snipers didn't feel like heroes. They felt like watchers, needed, yes, effective, yes, but deeply isolated. They saw too much. They felt too little. And when the war moved on, that inner landscape didn't shift easily. For some, it never did. In the next part, we'll examine how the legacy of the Stalingrad sniper shaped Soviet military doctrine long after the war, and how the quiet techniques developed in a ruined city became standard practice in conflicts around the world. When the dust finally settled over Stalingrad and the Red Army pushed the front westward, the lessons learned in the ruins did not disappear. They were studied, refined, and slowly absorbed into Soviet military doctrine. What began as desperate adaptation became formal strategy. The tactics used by snipers in the winter of 1942-43 were seen as proof that a well-trained sharpshooter could do more than just eliminate targets. They could shape the battlefield. After the war, Soviet military schools expanded their sniper training programs significantly. The sniper was no longer considered a support role, but an integral piece of infantry operations. Instructors who had fought in Stalingrad, or been trained by those who had, began teaching new generations not just how to shoot, but how to think. Lessons went far beyond marksmanship. Trainees learned about camouflage, patience, terrain reading, and psychological warfare. They were told how to read a street, the way a hunter reads the forest, how to use wind as a shield, and how to let the enemy's fear become a weapon more reliable than a rifle. Sniper schools were formalized across the USSR, some of them named after veterans like Vasily Zaitsev. These institutions emphasized endurance just as much as skill. Marches with full gear, sleep deprivation, exposure to cold, all to simulate the real emotional and physical pressure of combat sniping. One of the most lasting principles passed down from Stalingrad was the importance of independent decision-making. Snipers were taught to act without orders if necessary, to analyze the situation on their own, and to rely on intuition built from training. This approach went against the traditionally rigid Soviet chain of command, but proved invaluable in modern warfare. The Red Army began using snipers not just to support infantry, but to disrupt logistics, target officers, and paralyze communication. Reports from post-war exercises show that sniper teams were often inserted deep behind enemy lines to create confusion far greater than their numbers should allow. The psychological damage caused by an unseen shooter remained just as valuable as the physical. These lessons didn't stay within the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors trained Allied nations across Eastern Europe, Asia, and later the Middle East. Many of the tactics born in the factories and stairwells of Stalingrad were passed on to other armies, becoming part of guerrilla training manuals and special forces doctrine. Even nations opposed to the USSR quietly studied Soviet sniper methods. During the Cold War, Western analysts reviewed battlefield reports and personal memoirs, trying to reverse engineer the methods that had proven so effective. The emphasis on concealment, discipline, and terrain exploitation showed up in NATO sniper programs by the 1970s. In a way, the sniper war in Stalingrad never really ended, it simply evolved. Its DNA can still be found in modern conflicts, from urban operations in Chechnya to sniper duels in the Balkans and Middle East. Sniper tactics remain shaped by what worked in that frozen, shattered city on the Volga. Yet beyond doctrine and training, there was something else passed on. A mindset. A belief that stillness could be powerful, that watching could be more dangerous than shooting, and that fear, carefully applied, could stop an army in its tracks. The veterans of Stalingrad didn't always speak about these things openly. Many returned to quiet lives. But their influence lived on, in books, in lectures, in the quiet focus of a young soldier crawling into position with a scope and a breath held steady. In the next part, we'll shift from tactics to memory, how Soviet society remembered its snipers, how their stories were shaped by state narrative, and what was preserved, forgotten, or changed in the telling. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union began crafting its story of victory, one of unity, sacrifice, and triumph over impossible odds. Within that story, the snipers of Stalingrad held a special place. They weren't just soldiers, they were icons, shaped into symbols of the motherland's resolve. But like all symbols, their stories were selectively told. Only a handful of snipers, Zaitsev among them, were named, celebrated, immortalized in textbooks, war films, and propaganda posters. Their faces appeared on stamps, their rifles placed in museums, and their kills tallied with reverence. The rest, no less brave, faded into the background of history. The Soviet state needed heroes, but it needed them to be clean, clear, and useful. The gritty realities of the sniper's life, endless silence, mental strain, moral ambiguity, did not fit the narrative. There was little room for stories of guilt, for the psychological aftermath, or for the many unnamed marksmen and women who returned from war changed in ways they could not explain. Instead, the sniper was remembered as a stoic guardian of the city, a figure of calm precision, always righteous, never shaken. Schoolchildren were taught their names, rehearsed their kill counts, and were told that these heroes had saved the Soviet people through sheer discipline and love for their country. Some of it was true, much of it wasn't. In the tightly controlled world of Soviet media, stories were filtered. Snipers who had expressed doubts, or who struggled to reintegrate after the war, were left out. The many female snipers who suffered in silence were praised in theory, but often ignored in post-war policy. Many received few benefits. Some, after returning to civilian life, never mentioned the war again. One female veteran later said, "It was easier to let people think I had been a nurse. No one wanted to imagine a girl with a rifle." Museums in Volgograd, the new name for Stalingrad, featured recreated sniper nests and tributes to the most famous kills. Visitors could peer through scopes mounted on walls, view enemy uniforms recovered from sniper duels, and read captions that emphasized glory while omitting pain. The city's official narrative painted the sniper not as a quiet witness to horror, but as a sculptor of victory. Films reinforced this. Characters based loosely on real snipers appeared in state-sanctioned dramas, shown smiling after a perfect shot, never hesitating, never breaking. The tension, the sleepless nights, the sound of a bullet just missing, those parts rarely made it to the screen. Still, among veterans, and in quiet corners of post-war literature, the truth persisted. Memoirs appeared, some published unofficially, where snipers spoke of frostbitten fingers, of crying after the first kill, of lying in blood-soaked snow for days. They wrote not to accuse or to glorify, but simply to remember what it had cost. Some shared their stories only decades later, when the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed for freer speech. Their voices were older, but clear. "I did my duty," one said. "But I never stopped hearing the crack of the rifle." Over time, a more nuanced memory began to form, one that honored the courage of the snipers without simplifying their reality. Historians started to ask harder questions. Museums updated their exhibits. Readers sought out diaries and letters instead of slogans. And slowly the sniper was allowed to be human again. Not just a hero, but a person. In the next part, we'll explore what happened to the weapons themselves, the rifles of Stalingrad snipers that survived the war, and how they became symbols of memory, reverence, and even myth. In the aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad, as medals were handed out and ruins were slowly cleared, something else remained behind. Something quieter, but no less significant. The rifles. These were the tools of the sniper's trade, battered and cold, their wooden stocks scarred by frost, metal worn by hands that had held them in silence for hours on end. For many snipers, their rifle was not just a weapon. It was a companion, a shield, a diary written in oil and ash. Most used the Mosin Nagant's M1891/30 with the PU scope, a rugged, reliable, bolt-action rifle, already decades old by the time of the battle. Some of these rifles were mass-produced, indistinguishable at first glance, but in the hands of a sniper, they became unique. Modifications were common: leather wraps on the stock to keep the cheek from freezing in winter, cloth around the barrel to muffle sound, trigger adjustments for smoother release. Over time, the rifle became personalized, shaped by the user's habits and instincts. Some were given names, others carved with marks, tallies of kills, dates, initials of comrades lost. These marks were rarely shared. They were private inscriptions, not for glory, but for memory. After the war, a small number of these rifles were preserved by the state. They were placed in museums, most famously, the one belonging to Vasily Zaitsev, now housed in the Battle of Stalingrad State Historical Museum in Volgograd. Visitors can look through the scope he once used, peer down a barrel that fired some of the most famous shots in the war, and imagine the frozen streets on the other side. But for most snipers, their rifles were not displayed. They were turned in, stored in arsenals, disassembled, reassigned. Some were lost in later battles. Others remained in personal possession for years, hidden in attics or closets, kept not for defense, but because parting with them felt like parting with a part of the self. There are stories, half confirmed, half whispered, of veterans sleeping with their rifles under the bed, or refusing to let anyone else touch them. One man reportedly kept his rifle in a velvet-lined case, cleaned it every month, and opened it only on the anniversary of his first confirmed kill. When asked why, he said, "It's not pride, it's memory. It's what's left." The weapons themselves took on a kind of mythology. For younger soldiers and post-war enthusiasts, owning a PU-scoped Mosin Nagant became more than a collector's item. It was a link to legend. In Soviet shooting clubs, These rifles were treated with a reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. In literature and film, they became symbols of precision, of sacrifice, of a kind of silent heroism that transcended words. Yet not all snipers felt pride when looking at their old rifles. Some couldn't bear to see them again. There were reports of veterans refusing to visit museums that displayed their weapons, saying it felt like looking through a window into a room where someone had died. For them, the rifle wasn't a symbol. It was a reminder of waiting, of killing, of the unbearable weight of choosing the moment when another man's life would end. And yet, even with that burden, most understood the role their rifles had played. These weren't tools of cruelty, they were instruments of survival in a war that spared no one. When wielded with discipline, patience, and intention, the sniper's rifle represented control in a world that had lost all structure. It gave its user the ability to act deliberately, precisely, something rare in the chaos of Stalingrad. In the next part, we'll look at the modern-day legacy of these snipers, how their techniques, their psychology, and their legend continue to influence both military training and cultural memory in the 21st century. The snipers of Stalingrad may have fought their war more than 80 years ago, but their legacy endures, in classrooms, in military manuals, and in the quiet rituals of modern soldiers who still study their methods. What was born out of desperation in the bombed-out city has become a blueprint for precision warfare in the 21st century. Today, across the world, modern sniper programs, whether in Russia, the United States, or elsewhere, include lessons first proven on the frozen streets of Stalingrad: how to move unseen in urban terrain, how to blend into shattered landscapes, how to wait longer than your enemy can stand. The philosophy of patience, once passed from Vasily Zaitsev to his students in broken schoolhouses, is now codified in official doctrine. But beyond tactics, it's the mindset that continues to influence. Military instructors teach that the sniper must become invisible, not only to the eye, but to the rhythm of the battlefield, moving without drawing attention, breathing without thought, thinking one step ahead. These ideas were lived out by Soviet snipers, who crawled through glass and ash with frostbitten hands, who learned to fire between their own heartbeats. In many ways, they laid the foundation for modern asymmetric warfare, where small, mobile forces can exert control far beyond their numbers. In recent conflicts, from Iraq to Ukraine, snipers have again become central players. Videos circulate of lone shooters pinning down entire squads, of unseen rifles changing the tempo of battles. And often, the images we see echo those from Stalingrad: a barrel peeking from rubble, a shooter wrapped in cloth, the eerie silence before a shot. For Russia, the legacy of the Stalingrad sniper remains especially potent. In both training and national memory, snipers are elevated not only for their effectiveness, but for what they represent: intelligence, self-control, and sacrifice. Military parades still include references to legendary figures like Zaitsev, and youth programs such as WWII introduce young recruits to the basics of long-range marksmanship under banners of historical pride. But the cultural impact extends beyond the armed forces. In books, films, and video games, the sniper has become an almost mythical figure, one who walks between worlds, observing but unseen, feared but not fully understood. That myth owes much to Stalingrad. The ruins, the snow, the slow, calculated hunt. It created an atmosphere so compelling that it has become cinematic language. Still, reality is more complex than legend. Veterans and historians alike have warned against glamorizing the sniper's role. They remind us that for every confirmed kill, there was a man or woman behind the trigger who carried that shot forever. The legacy is not only one of skill, but of burden. Museums across Russia, especially in Volgograd, continue to preserve sniper relics: rifles behind glass, photos of young men and women in oversized coats, letters home written in pencil. Tour guides tell the stories carefully, mixing pride with respect. And among visitors, both young recruits and curious civilians, there's often a moment of quiet at these displays. As if the stillness once demanded by the sniper still lingers around the weapons they used. In other parts of the world, the lessons of Stalingrad are studied with both admiration and caution. Western snipers read translated manuals, examined Soviet tactics, and recognized that behind every effective method was a life shaped by hardship. The sniper is no longer just a role. It's a psychological discipline, one that requires self-mastery before mastery of the weapon. In the next and final part, we'll return to where it all began, the shattered city itself. We'll look at what Stalingrad became after the battle, what was rebuilt, what was lost, and how the ghosts of those who once lay still with rifles still shape the soul of a city reborn from fire. When the last German units surrendered in February 1943, the city of Stalingrad was barely a city at all. It was a skeleton of concrete and steel, burned black and buried in ice, its streets littered with frozen bodies and twisted metal. Over 90% of the buildings had been damaged or destroyed. But in the ruins something remained. A quiet, unspoken memory of what had taken place, etched into the bricks, the basements, the craters. For the snipers who had crawled through its alleys and waited in its shadows, Stalingrad was more than a battlefield. It was a world within a world, a place where time slowed, where breath and silence became weapons, where life and death were separated by a single second. After the war, the city was rebuilt. Stalin ordered it restored as a symbol of Soviet resilience, and reconstruction began almost immediately. New apartment blocks rose where sniper nests had once been. Tram lines returned. Schools were reopened. Streets were renamed. But for those who had fought there, especially the snipers, the new city did not erase the old one. Beneath every new foundation, they could still see the outlines of former buildings. Remember the angles, the kill zones, the windows that once glinted with enemy scopes. Veterans who visited years later spoke of walking through familiar blocks and still instinctively scanning rooftops. The habits never left. In 1961, Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization efforts. The name changed, but the memory didn't. Monuments were erected, most famously the towering Motherland Calls statue on Mamayev Kurgan, where some of the fiercest fighting occurred. At its base lie the graves of many Soviet soldiers, including snipers. But what remains most powerful in Volgograd is not the statues, but the silence in certain corners. A courtyard where the wind whistles just so. A staircase where footsteps echo too loudly. Places where tourists fall quiet without knowing why. The story of the snipers lives there, not just in museums or guided tours, but in the soul of the city itself. Local children still learn the names. Some schools hold annual readings of wartime letters. In old neighborhoods, older residents still tell visitors where the girl sniper once waited, or where that German officer was shot from across the square. These stories pass not as facts, but as inheritance. Over time, memory and myth blur. But even as the city grows, modernizes, and changes, the legacy of the sniper war continues. It's in the way Volgograd honors stillness, in the way veterans are treated with a unique reverence, in the way silence, so often avoided in other places, is allowed to exist here. Today, few of the original snipers are still alive. Most passed quietly, many without ever telling their full story. But their role in one of the most brutal battles in history is etched into more than just granite. It lives in the training of modern soldiers, it lives in books, in letters, in every rifle displayed behind museum glass. And it lives in the idea that even in the loudest, most destructive war, there is power in quiet, in focus, in patience. The snipers of Stalingrad didn't win the battle alone, but they helped shape its rhythm. They slowed the enemy's advance, they turned fear into a force, and they showed that even in the darkest winter, in the coldest silence, a single shot, carefully placed, could change the course of history.